Funding for Current Conversations is provided by the University of Oklahoma President's Office, the OU Office of Student Affairs, OU Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we're at the Western History Collection on the campus of the University of Oklahoma, and we're speaking with philosopher Dr. Nancy Snow about a cornerstone concept of Greek philosophy that is still fundamental to Western culture today. She researches and writes about the concept that the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, or happiness, or human flourishing. She directs the University of Oklahoma's Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing. Join us for this memorable conversation. It is so exciting that we're going to be talking today about connections between concepts and values in ancient Greek thought and relevance to the current day-to-day. But before we get to that, could you talk a little bit about the Greek concept of eudaimonia, what it meant to the Greeks and the role it played in Greek thought, at least an overview of all of that?
Well, that is quite a question. Eudaimonia is a Greek term referring to flourishing. It's been translated in various ways, for example, as happiness. Flourishing is probably the best we can do. Eudaimonia was the best and most choice-worthy good in the philosophy of Aristotle. It also played a role in the philosophy of the Stoics, who were later subsequent thinkers to Aristotle. For Aristotle, virtue is the stable and controlling element in a life of eudaimonia, but external goods are also needed. For the Stoics, virtue is it. We don't have to have external goods in order to flourish.
You don't worry about what happens in the world for the Stoics.
Right. It's a very different kind of approach. So as long as you have virtue, you're living a flourishing life. But for Aristotle, you needed external goods such as noble birth, to have good children, not to be ugly.
Healthy,
to have a certain amount of wealth and material goods. And so today we are incorporating those notions in a slightly different way. So we are using the idea that virtue is still the stable and controlling element in eudaimonia, but our external goods are sort of different. So for today, for example, you can't really flourish unless you have clean water, or unless you have good housing, or unless you have good health care. So I think Aristotle's model has a lot of potential for our world today, even though there are some really relevant differences.
Let me clarify something. So the way that people normally use the word happiness is maybe a kind of a simplistic, maybe just kind of overly simple notion of eudaimonia. It's happiness connected to a whole network of, I think, other things you're mentioning, virtue, community, is that right?
It is. Eudaimonia, or flourishing, is had in the living of a life. So it's how you live your life. It's living well. And you can be happy or not at various times of your life. And you can be happy in different ways. For example, you can feel momentary pleasure or joy or contentment, but a flourishing life is one that you can identify over the course of a lifespan.
So in contemporary parlance, some people might say, well, I'm living for the moment. I'm a hedonist or whatever. That's what matters to me. What I feel good after is what the way Hemingway said. But you're saying there's this other view that's more enduring, that's Aristotle's, and probably should matter more to us, where it's the life well lived.
Right, exactly. It's a life well lived. It's a life lived in community with others. For Aristotle thought that we were political animals or social animals. So, you can't flourish apart from other people. So for Aristotle, there were basically three big categories: beasts, humans, and gods. And the beasts were subhuman. They didn't live in the kind of community that we have. Gods were superhuman. They didn't need that community, but we as humans can only flourish in the company of others.
I want to underline what you're saying there, because it seems like this is a really radical, Aristotle intended this in a radical way. It's not a convenience to be in a community. You are born into community, and that, just as fish are born into the water, we're born into community. There's no life outside of that. That's it for us, right?
Right.
You've got to make that work.
Exactly. Living in community isn't a convenience, it's a necessity.
Yeah, it's because it's where you are. You're just denying where you really are if you don't deal with your responsibility as a citizen, polis, being in community in every way possible.
Well, you're not only denying who you really are, but you're stunting part of your nature. You're
Okay.
stunting part of yourself if you remove yourself from interactions with others.
Okay. So maybe you're just living a kind of partial version of your life, a degraded life, if you don't live fully in community.
Exactly.
Now, what you're talking about here, this sort of more contextualized idea of happiness, is really fundamental for Western thought, right? Could you put it in a sort of broader context? What's been the influence of this view of happiness and the life well lived?
Well, again, this is a huge question. It's a huge question, but it's been that conception has been very influential. So if we go to the Middle Ages, for example, and we look at the work of Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas was very much influenced by Aristotle and his conception of eudaimonia and his conception of ethics. Now, for Aquinas, the summum bonum, the highest good, had both a natural and a supernatural component. And the supernatural component was unification with God, but the natural component is very much like Aristotle, very much a life lived in community with others. Not completely the same, of course. There are some really important differences, such as natural law, which is part of our makeup as humans for Aquinas, but there are certainly influences from Aristotle. Then there was a period in modern philosophy where the Aristotelian Thomistic worldview sort of went off the map. And that was when Kant and Hume and John Stuart Mill were writing their ethics, their views of sentimentalism and rationalism and then utilitarianism. Later in the 20th century, virtue ethics enjoyed a renaissance. And so there were some very interesting writers such as Alistair MacIntyre and Rosalind Hursthouse who were influenced by Aristotle or writing in the Neo-Aristotelian tradition. So this resurgence of virtue ethics is now alive and well and really taking off.
Let me try a metaphor on you to see if I've got this right. I think you're talking about something like Aristotle setting a stage, a very large stage. And then on the stage is the notion of community, living a life where you're involved with community, you acknowledge that. And then there are sets on that stage that might be different religions, different ethical systems or whatever, but still in Western culture who set the stage for all of these belief systems and ways of thinking about ethics is Aristotle with this thinking about eudaimonia.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Some others might want to go further back to Plato.
Okay.
I personally think that Aristotle is more influential in today's day and age than Plato is. But, there's some reasonable disagreements about who really has pride of place in this debate. But as far as your description goes about this sort of basic stage setting that Aristotle did, and then, putting up different sets, you might say, in different cultural periods, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
I think somebody who's hearing this kind of discussion for the first time could easily be saying, well, yeah, how else could you think about things? But I think your point is that thinking about the larger picture rather than just living for the moment, et cetera, that is really a choice. There are other ways to go.
Oh, sure.
And this virtue, doing things that are going to actually benefit you, that is a particular path that, as you say, he set us on.
Absolutely. And if you go back to the Nicomachean Ethics, which is Aristotle's major ethical work, you can see that he goes through some of the options. So he goes, for example, through the life of pleasure. And these were options that were on the table at his time, developed by various philosophers and in the community at large. And he looks at the life of pleasure and he says, well, this is just a life of grazing animals. And he looks at the life of money-making and says, this isn't going to give you lasting contentment or happiness. And so there are a couple of other options, for example, the life of honor, which depends on how others view you. And so at the end of the day, then it comes down to the life of virtue and eudaimonia. The interesting thing about the Nicomachean Ethics is that there's a crucial ambiguity in conceptions of eudaimonia. And that's because of the complexity of our nature. So eudaimonia is either a life of study and contemplation, because we're rational animals, or it's a life of virtuous activity in the polis, because we're animals who can act rationally.
But again, all the options that you quoted from Aristotle, there would be contemporary versions of them. I mean, there are people that just live for money right now, who live for the moment, don't want to go beyond that. External validation. I know folks, maybe certain parts of my own life, you know, you get kind of enamored with that. You just want to be approved of by other people. So these all have contemporary relevance.
Absolutely. I mean, you might remember the old saying, there's nothing new under the sun. And maybe there is and maybe there isn't, but the ideas that come from the ancients are still very much alive and well in their own garb today.
Okay, I think what might help people on this too is maybe to think about something even more specific, say the United States. In the founding of this country, maybe some of the founding documents of the United States, do you see the influence of Greek culture and eudaimonia there?
Certainly the founding fathers knew Greek philosophy. They certainly did. And we have in the Declaration of Independence life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, which may actually have come from the philosopher John Locke, who used the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. But surely the pursuit of happiness was part of what they thought was valuable. And they thought it was valuable to be able to pursue happiness freely, without a tyrant ruling over them, without a despot ruling over them. So very much in tune with the notion of Athenian democracy that was developing at the time that Aristotle wrote.
Well, and it seems too that the context of the Constitution and the Declaration, et cetera, make it really clear that it's not happiness in a very narrow sense. It's not hedonism. It's the life well lived.
Right.
The Republic is a place that's worth living in.
Right, right. And the way to achieve happiness for the founding fathers was through engaged in active citizenship.
Yeah. Okay, now you take all of this so seriously, and this University of Oklahoma takes this so seriously, that there's an institute now, the Institute for the Study of Human Flourishing, and you, in fact, are a professor who studies this, but you're also the director of that institute. Could you tell us about it?
Sure. Well, the Institute was actually the brainchild of the provost, Kyle Harper, and a number of other faculty here at OU whom he enlisted to think through what the Institute would be. And they got a planning grant from the John Templeton Foundation to engage in a series of discussions with OU faculty, staff, and students about what they wanted OU graduates to look like. So the question really, as I understand it, was what virtues do we want OU students to have when they leave the institution? And by extension, what virtues are usable and useful for flourishing in the state of Oklahoma? And what they did was identify 9 virtues falling into 3 different categories: intellectual, executive, and civic. And those virtues don't really have an Aristotelian basis. And the point behind that was to get the greatest amount of buy-in and be as neutral as possible so that the appeal could be as wide as possible. That said, I think there are many parallels and many points of contact with Aristotle, but there are also potential areas of overlap with other traditions, which makes it very easy to go into the community and say, look, you're doing this already. Bring this to conscious awareness. There's a lot going on here in Oklahoma that's very consistent with the virtues and the conception of flourishing as thriving that the Institute endorses. So compassion is one of our virtues. Compassion wasn't on Aristotle's list, by the way, but compassion is something that's very useful in today's society, very helpful, very necessary to flourishing.
Missing in today's society a lot of times.
Missing a lot of times, but also here in ways that we sometimes don't notice, don't highlight, don't bring to the forefront of our consciousness. And so what the Institute is doing is really engaging in a threefold mission. The first is to promote virtue and flourishing among OU students. The second is to promote the study and science of virtue and flourishing. And the third is to promote flourishing of all Oklahomans. And I've added some international outreach to that. But the idea that we are working with is the notion that people are already doing a lot of virtuous things. So let's catch people doing something right and then highlight it, support it, help that along, bring it to conscious awareness. And we think, or at least I think, having been here for a little over a year and having a very high learning curve.
You're an old timer.
Thank you. But I feel that I'm still very much in learning mode about Oklahoma. But I see a lot of growth potential, a mindset that's ready to change, a sort of collaborative spirit that's willing to get together and move forward in terms of dealing with social issues. So it's been very gratifying here that there's been so much uptake about what we do in the community.
Now you have an affiliated faculty, and you've got some staff, and you put on seminars and conferences. So you're really a kind of source of energy in this area for this university and for the state.
Yeah, and we do outreach activities. We have 5 partner high schools. We have a partner community organization. And the idea with respect to those outreach activities is that we are offering an invitation, not an imposition. So we invite you to work with us to help promote virtues and flourishing. And part of the idea here is to start opening conversations, start getting people to think in these terms, and then we're here to walk along with these groups. So we are here not for the moment. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we're in for the long haul. So, we want to be, the Greek adjective is eudaimon. We want to be eudaimon along with you as you move forward in your community activities.
Flourishing along with you?
We want to flourish with you.
Yeah,
we want to flourish with you.
2 thoughts. The Institute is wonderful. It's so exciting.
Thank you.
First thought is it commits the institution to an ancient tradition and of being very mindful about how we live and what the well-lived life is, and that seems like a virtue to do that. That's a really good thing. But the second response is a question. If Western culture is so fundamentally shaped by this stage setting that we both think Aristotle largely put in place, why do we need to study it? It's there. It's the water we already swim in. So why do we need to call attention to it?
Well, good question. And as far as your first observation, I think it's no accident that we're going back to ancient traditions. The provost is a classicist, so his vision, and he's a scholar of Roman history and Roman literature, and so his vision is very much influenced by the ancient world. To your second point, why do we need to study it? Well, we speak language, don't we? Why do we need to study language? In order to get better at it, in order to do it correctly. So we need to study Aristotle because even though, and flourishing, because even though we are naturally inclined in that direction, we are always able to do better. We're always able to fine-tune. We're always able to be more intentional and deliberate about what we do.
I don't mean this to sound critical of our culture particularly, but wouldn't you also say that there's a little bit of entropy that seems to be at work in culture, and in a highly commercialized, consumer-oriented culture, things maybe fall apart a little bit and need to be redirected, nudged back in the right direction.
Right.
Don't you think that maybe you're part of that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, we're part of the nudging because a number of the people with whom I've interacted here in Oklahoma think that things have gone off the rails a little bit, think that we've gone too far in terms of consumerism. And so when things go off the rails, when the pendulum swings too far in one direction, then we kind of got to nudge it back to a different direction. So part of what we're tapping into here is not only this positive energy and momentum, but a positive energy and momentum that's born of a certain discontent with the way things are, and informed by an optimism that things can and should and will be better. So it isn't the kind of discontent that says, oh, woe is me, there's nothing we can do. That's not at all a part of what I've discovered in Oklahoma. Part of this is we are looking for something to direct and focus our efforts. And the Institute is trying to help with that direction and focusing.
In fact, as a philosopher, wouldn't you probably subscribe to this, that at any point in human history, if a microphone is put in front of somebody, so how's it going? It is going to be the worst of times and the best of times. I mean, isn't that just sort of always the case, that there is a dark side to our life, always, things could always be better, and there are particular opportunities that seem the best that have ever been at that particular moment. Very often people see both of those, right?
Absolutely, I think that's absolutely true. So we have the angel on one shoulder and the demon on the other, and if we look the one way, then we get the negative. When we look the other way, we get the positive. And what the Institute hopes to do is to nudge people over to that positive and provide them with resources and training and direction and encouragement to develop the potentialities they have for goodness.
Now, I've asked you a lot of big questions. This is another big question. But from this perspective of Greek thought and eudaimonia, somebody looking out across American culture, seems like some things are going to show up as areas in need of attention more than others. From this perspective, what does one most readily see as needing attention in the culture, needing a little nudging?
Well, I think that probably there are 3 areas, 2 of which are interrelated. Poverty and health are 2 issues that need to be addressed. And they have to do with maintaining the community, with the notion that in this country today, a sense of community has been lost. And so from an Aristotelian perspective, or from the perspective of the Institute, one thing that is vital for flourishing is reviving a sense of healthy community, a sense in which no one is left behind, no one is left to starve or to suffer, where everyone is really taken care of by others. So we all take care of each other. So there's one area that I think needs attention. Another area is, and we've seen this in this election cycle, I mean, it's ubiquitous.
Presidential election cycle.
Presidential election cycle, but is a lack of civility. Civility has really become lost as part of our political discourse, and the problem is that is threatening to tear communities apart, to tear families apart. So civility is one of the civic virtues that the Institute promotes. And so the idea here is that we're trying to impress upon students especially the notion that they can disagree and have reasonable disagreements that are deep-seated, deeply held, passionately felt, and yet be nice to each other, yet be civil, not be insulting, not be denigrating, respect the other person. That's a big part of what we are trying to do, is to restore that sort of discourse of civility in our society.
Is it possible that what you're doing here, you and your colleagues, could become a movement, really? I mean, this is not something shallow. This isn't the power of positive thinking or, just to think pretty thoughts. This is a more comprehensive way of looking at our lives that you've brought into higher education. And we don't always think of higher education as having that mission. This could be very influential across the country, couldn't it?
Well, I would hope so, but we're not the only ones who are doing it.
Okay,
so in Great Britain, for example, there's a Templeton-funded Jubilee Center they're explicitly Aristotelian. So they are working along the same path. There are other Templeton-founded and other institutes in the country who are doing the same kinds of things. So our mission here is unique in that we are both directed toward the student and academics on the one hand, and then community outreach on the other. So yeah, there could be a movement here, and certainly there's been very gratifying uptake from the community. People who, from various religious perspectives or educational perspectives, are working for the same end. So I think that if there is a movement afoot, it's not only going to be directed by the Aristotelian or other academic institutions, it's going to come from a number of different sectors in society.
But at the same time, and I think you're saying this too, this isn't just a matter of local concern. This is a major flagship university. This is an important program that the university is foregrounding. So the influence of what you're doing really could be felt nationally. I mean, you really could have followers. You really could have imitators, other institutions wanting to do what you're doing here.
I think we have that already. We did have some interest from a university in California because we're promoting virtue in our classes here, and we're developing what we call the OU model of virtue assessment. So there has to be a way to measure how well students understand the virtues that they're being taught, whether they actualize them in their lives and so on. We are working on that. It's a hard problem, but we're working on it. And other institutions want to know what we're doing. So we're sharing information with them. Also in terms of our community outreach, we are working with an organization in Oklahoma City, SALT and Light Leadership Training. And we are working with Thriving Cities from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Culture at the University of Virginia to work on community engagement. And the topic of their project that we're helping them with at this point is entitled How are the Child Flourishing in Oklahoma City? And we are hoping to develop that as a model for nationwide engagement.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, just real quickly, if anybody wants to follow up on any of the ideas that you've been talking about here today, they can go to your website. There are a lot of resources there. We'll have that in the credits. Okay, last thing I want to make sure to ask you, fearless forecast. As you look into the future, and as a philosopher, I'm sure you can do this, 10, 20 years down the road, what do you see on the horizon that could have an important influence, good or bad, in regard to human flourishing as you've been talking about it?
Well, that's a great question, and I tend to be positive. I tend to be an optimist, so I think we're at a turning point here. And my fearless forecast is that we are going to recognize that we need to change some of our ways, develop a greater sense of community, and move forward together. So my fearless forecast is that we're going to improve the chances of flourishing over the long haul. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to be quick. But I think that people are realizing that the life of momentary pleasure is a dead end.
Or maybe even the acquisition of money or any one thing. It seems to me that one of the themes running through everything you've said is to move away from fragmentation, the various parts of what makes up our humanity, and embrace the whole thing.
Exactly, and embrace the whole thing in a balanced way.
Yeah. Dr. Nancy Snow, thank you very much for being with us here today. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation and appreciate your questions.
Thank you for joining us. Please join us next time for more current conversations. Thank you for watching.